Imagine standing against injustice with nothing but grit and a mother's love. Abby Montgomery did, facing doctors who valued coins over life and bankers who preyed on the weak. But in the shadows of the cold prairie, one man defied the rules to deliver justice in a way no law could measure. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable Western experiences.
Wyoming Territory. Winter, 1878. The wind howled down Main Street like a wounded dog. It was the kind of cold that stole your breath, the kind that settled deep into your bones and just stayed there. Abigail Montgomery didn't feel the cold. Not really. She only felt the burning heat radiating from the 8-year-old girl in her arms. Clara, her sweet Clara. The childess breathing was a wet, heavy rattle. Every inhale sounded like tearing paper. Abby kept her head down against the blowing snow. She marched toward the only brick building at the end of the street, the Doctor.'s clinic. In her right coat pocket, her numb fingers rubbed against cold metal. She didn't need to count it. She had done that 100 times in the dark, 37 cents in mixed silver and copper. One worn dime, 3 pennies pried from the cracks of her kitchen floorboards. 50 cents, exactly. A widow's entire fortune in the world. She pushed through the heavy oak door of Dr. Josiah Vance's clinic. A bell chimed. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, strong tobacco, and carbolic acid. It was warm, painfully warm. Dr. Vance stood by the potbelly stove. He was a plump man, well-fed. He wore a crisp white coat over a fine wool vest. He was busy laughing at a joke told by the banker's wife, who was sitting in the exam chair for a mild headache. Abby stood by the door, dripping snow, shivering. Clara whimpered against her shoulder. Vance glanced over. His smile faded. He took his time finishing with the banker's wife, ushering her out with a polite bow before turning to Abby. He didn't offer her a chair. "Pneumonia," Vance said a few minutes later. He pulled his stethoscope from Clara's small chest. He wiped the earpieces with a cloth. "A bad case, Mrs. Montgomery. She needs the strong camphor compound and a quinine tincture." Abby felt a rush of desperate hope. "Please, give it to her." Vance walked behind his heavy mahogany desk. He opened his ledger. "That will be $3.50. Payable up front. You understand my position. Times are hard." The room went dead quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Abby's hand trembled. She pulled her fist from her pocket and opened her fingers over the Doctor.'s polished desk. The coins spilled out, a pathetic, meager pile. "I only have 50 cents, she whispered. Her voice broke. She hated herself for it, but she swallowed her pride. "I can wash your floors. I can mend your shirts. I will pay you the rest next week, Doctor. I swear on my life." Vance sighed. It was a practiced, tired sigh. He pushed the coins back toward her with the tip of his silver pen. "This is a medical practice, Mrs. Montgomery, not a charity ward. My policies are strict. I cannot give you $3 worth of medicine for 50 cents. You should take her home. Keep her warm. Brew some willow bark." He was sending them out to die. Abby stared at him. The room spun. Clara coughed, a violent, racking sound that brought up a spot of blood on Abby's threadbare collar. Abby pulled the child tighter. The tears came then, hot and humiliating. "Please," she begged. "Good day, Mrs. Montgomery," Vance said, turning his back. From the dark corner of the waiting room, a chair scraped hard against the floorboards. Abby jumped. She hadn't even realized anyone else was there. A man stepped into the lamplight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a heavy canvas duster and worn leather boots. His face was weathered, marked by old sun and older grief. It was Silas Thorne. The town called him the Silent Rancher. He rarely came into town. He never spoke when he did. Silas didn't look at Abby. He walked straight to the mahogany desk. He reached into his pocket. He brought out a heavy, shining gold double eagle. $20. He dropped it onto the ledger. Clack! The sound was louder than a gunshot in the quiet room. "I'll pay for everything she needs," Silas said. His voice was deep, rough, like a rusty gate swing open for the first time in years. Vance spun around, his eyes wide, staring at the gold. "Mr. Thorne, well, that is very generous, but—" Silas planted his hands on the desk. He leaned in, towering over the plump doctor. His eyes were cold iron. When he spoke, his words rang out, loud and deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "A human life isn't measured by the coins in her pocket, Doctor," Silas said, his voice echoing off the clinic walls. "The right to medical care, when hovering between life and death, is a basic human right. It is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy. You wear that white coat to save lives, not to sort human dignity by social class. Do your job." Vance swallowed hard, his face flushed bright red. He snatched the gold coin off the desk. Of course, right away." Silas didn't wait for a thank you. He turned, walked back to his dark corner, sat down, and pulled his hat low over his eyes. Abby stood frozen. She looked at the giant of a man in the corner. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to speak. She wanted to fall to her knees. But Silas had already shut the world away. 10 minutes later, Abby walked out into the bitter wind. She held a brown glass bottle tight against her chest. Clara was asleep against her shoulder. For the first time in 3 days, Abby felt a spark of hope. Inside the clinic, the door clicked shut. Dr. Vance stood alone with his assistant, a young, nervous boy named Miller. Vance held the $20 gold piece to the light, smiling as it gleamed. "Doctor," Miller said softly, "you gave her the bottle from the back shelf, the expired belladonna mix. That's not the strong camphor." Vance slipped the gold into his vest pocket. He adjusted his cuffs, his face entirely unbothered. "That widow doesn't know the difference, Miller. And that brutal rancher certainly doesn't. We gave her medicine. That covers my obligation." Vance patted his pocket. "The good stuff costs me money to order. Put the cheap stock on the ledger. We're keeping the change." The clock on the mantel ticked. It was a cruel, steady sound. 2 days had passed. 2 long, dark days since the clinic. Abby sat by the bed. She held a damp cloth to Clara's forehead. The little girl was burning. Her skin felt like dry paper left too close to a stove. The medicine hadn't worked. In fact, Clara was worse. Her breathing wasn't just a rattle anymore. It was a fight. Every gasp was a battle she was slowly losing. Abby picked up the brown glass bottle. She pulled the cork. She smelled it. Nothing. No sharp scent of camphor. No bitter tang of quinine. She poured a drop onto her finger. She touched it to her tongue. It tasted like old water and stale sugar. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Panic rose in her chest. It was cold and sharp. She wrapped Clara in 2 heavy wool blankets. She stoked the fire to keep the room warm. Then, she threw on her coat. She didn't bother with a hat. She ran. The snow was coming down hard again. It stung her eyes. She didn't care. She reached the clinic and hit the door with her shoulder. It swung open, hitting the wall with a crack. The clinic was empty, except for Miller. The young assistant was sweeping the floor. He jumped at the noise. He dropped his broom. "Where is he?" Abby demanded. Her chest heaved.
"Dr. Vance is out."
Miller stammered. He wouldn't look at her. He looked at his boots. "He's at Mr. Sterling's house. A dinner party." Abby stepped closer. She pulled the brown bottle from her pocket and slammed it onto the desk. "What is this, Miller? Tell me what this is, because it is not camphor." Miller backed up. He hit the supply cabinet. He was a boy, really, maybe 19, and he looked terrified. I don't know, Mrs. Montgomery." My daughter is dying. Abby S. voice wasn't a yell. It was a low, hard whisper. It was worse than a yell. A man paid $20 in gold for medicine. Good medicine. What is in this bottle? Miller broke. He put his hands over his face. A sob hitched in his throat. It's belladonna mix, he cried. Expaxed. 2 years old. It's mostly just syrup and water now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He told me to give it to you. He said you wouldn't know the difference. He put the gold in his safe. Abby stopped breathing. The room tilted. A doctor. A man sworn to heal. He had stolen a gold piece and sent a child home with sugar water. He traded Clara's life for pocket change. She didn't hit the boy. She didn't scream. She turned on her heel and walked out. The wind hit her again. She headed for the rich end of town, toward Sterling's mansion. The banker S. house sat on a hill. It had real glass windows, gas lamps burning bright on the porch. She could hear piano music spilling out into the cold night. Before she got 10 steps from the clinic, a hand grabbed her arm. It was Hattie Miller, the general store owner. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, carrying a basket of kindling. Hattie was old, sharp-eyed, and missed nothing in this town. Abby, Hattie said, where are you going looking like a ghost with a gun? Vance, Abby choked out. The tears finally came. They froze on her cheeks. He lied. He kept the money. He gave Clara bad medicine. She's dying, Hattie. I'm going to Sterling's house. I'm going to drag him out by his collar. Hattie's face hardened. She looked up the hill at the shining mansion. Then she looked at Abby. She pulled Abby into the alley, out of the worst of the wind. You listen to me, Abby Montgomery, Hattie said. Her voice was firm, steady, like bedrock. You don't go up that hill right now. Deputy Boone is working security for that party. He will throw you in the dirt. He will lock you up for disturbing the peace. And your little girl will be left alone. I don't care, Abby cried. They can't treat us like this. We are people. Clara is a person. Hattie gripped Abby's shoulders. She shook her just a little, just enough to ground her. Look at me, Hattie commanded. Poverty doesn't strip you of your basic human rights, Abby. You hear me? You have the right to demand justice because you breathe the same air as that banker and that crooked doctor. Respect cannot be bought with gold. It is a natural right from the moment you are born. But you can't fight them if you're sitting in a jail cell. And you can't fight them if Clara dies tonight. Abby gasped for air. Then what do I do? Hattie, what do I do? There is only one man in this county who knows medicine better than Josiah Vance, Hattie said softly. But he hasn't touched a patient in 5 years. Silas Thorne. Hattie nodded. The Thorne Ranch is 2 miles out. It's just a bad walk in this snow. And Silas, he's a hard man to reach. But he paid for that medicine. He cared enough to do that. Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't thank Hattie. She just turned and ran. Not up the hill, out of town. 2 miles. The snow was up to her knees. The wind pushed against her like a physical hand. Her boots soaked through. Her toes went numb, then her fingers. She kept her eyes on the dark horizon. She thought of Clara's rattling breath. She put one foot in front of the other. It took her an hour. It felt like 10. Finally, the looming shape of the Thorne Ranch appeared. A massive dark barn, a sturdy log house. A single light burned in a side window. Abby staggered up onto the porch. She collapsed against the heavy wooden door. She hammered her fists against the wood. Please, she screamed into the wind. Please. The door swung inward. Abby fell forward onto the floorboards. Silas Thorne stood over her. He held a Winchester rifle in one hand, a kerosene lantern in the other. He wore a heavy wool shirt and suspenders. His face was shadowed. Mrs. Montgomery, he said. His voice was low, surprised. Abby pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. She looked up at him. She was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. "Mr. Thorne," she gasped, "I know I have no right to ask. You already did more than anyone. But the doctor, he gave us fake medicine. He kept the money. My daughter is dying." Silas didn't move. He looked at her wet clothes, her blue lips. "Hattie Miller says you were a doctor," Abby pleaded. "In the war. Please, I will work for you for the rest of my life. I will clean your stalls. I will do anything. Just save my little girl." Silas stared at the floor. The silence stretched. It was heavy. Abby could see the muscles in his jaw working. He was fighting a war inside his own head. Ghosts. Hattie had said Silas was haunted by ghosts. Silas looked up. He looked past Abby, out into the driving snow. Then, he leaned the rifle against the wall. "Get up, Mrs. Montgomery," he said softly. He walked over to a heavy oak trunk in the corner of the room. He flipped the brass latches. He pulled out a worn black leather medical bag. It looked heavy. It looked old. He grabbed a thick bearskin coat off a peg. He threw it over Abby's shaking shoulders. "My wagon is in the barn," Silas said. "We're losing time. Let's go." The wagon ride was a blur of snow and darkness. Silas drove the team hard. He didn't speak. Abby sat beside him, huddled under the bearskin coat. She prayed silently with every bump in the road. When they reached the cabin, Silas tied off the horses. He grabbed his leather bag. He didn't wait for Abby. He pushed through the front door. The cabin was warm, but it felt like a tomb. Clara lay perfectly still under the blankets. Her face was gray. Her lips were a terrible shade of blue. Silas dropped his coat on a chair. He walked to the bed. Abby watched from the doorway. She held her breath. Silas didn't use a stethoscope. He sat on the edge of the bed. He unbuttoned Clara's nightgown, just enough to place his bare ear flat against her small, hot chest. He closed his eyes. He listened. Seconds ticked by. Silas sat up. His face was unreadable, but his hands were moving fast. "Lobar pneumonia," he said. His voice was all business now. Crisp. Commanding. "Both lungs are heavy with fluid. She's suffocating." He opened the black leather bag. The smell of real medicine filled the room. Sharp. Clean. "Mrs. Montgomery, I need boiling water. Right now. I need clean linen strips. And add black pepper from your pantry." Abby moved. She didn't ask questions. She threw wood in the stove. She put the kettle on. She tore a clean cotton sheet into long strips. Silas pulled glass vials from his bag. He measured drops into a tin cup. He crushed dried roots in a small mortar. "Elecampane root," he muttered, almost to himself. "To open the lungs, we're going to make a poultice. We need to draw the heat out and break the fluid." For the next 3 hours, it was a dance. They worked together. Silas applied the blistering poultice to Clara's chest. Abby held the child's hands. Silas poured the herbal mixture down Clara's throat, drop by drop, waiting for her to swallow. He made a tent over the bed with a blanket and placed a bowl of steaming water and eucalyptus under it. "Breathe, little one," Silas murmured. "Just breathe." Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock. The tension in the room was thick. Silas never left the chair beside the bed. He kept 2 fingers pressed gently to Clara's wrist, tracking her pulse. Around 3 in the morning, the harsh rattling sound began to soften. It didn't stop, but it lost its sharp edge. The terrible blue color faded from Clara's lips. A pale pink crept back into her cheeks. Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 years. He leaned back in the wooden chair. He ran a hand over his tired face. Abby poured a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. She walked over and handed it to him. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas took the cup. He looked at the black liquid, then at the fire burning in the stove. "She's not out of the woods," he said quietly. "But the fever is breaking." The poultice did its job. If she sleeps through the morning, she'll live. Abby sat in the rocking chair opposite him. The adrenaline was leaving her body. Exhaustion was settling into her bones. But her mind was racing. She looked at the big, quiet man. He had saved them. Again. "Why did you stop?" Abby asked. The question slipped out for she could stop it. Silas didn't flinch. He just looked at the fire. "My wife," Silas said. His voice was hollow. "Clara. Her name was Clara, too." Abby's breath caught. "It was a bad winter, like this one," Silas continued. "5 years ago, she went into labor early. A storm hit. Nobody could get to the ranch. I was a surgeon. I had taken bullets out of men's hearts. I thought I knew everything, but I couldn't stop the bleeding. I lost them both, right there in my own bed. My hands couldn't save the only thing that mattered." He looked down at his large, calloused hands. "I swore I'd never open that bag again. A doctor who can't save his own family has no right to hold the title." Abby leaned forward. "That's a lie, Silas Thorne." He looked up at her, surprised. "You saved my daughter tonight," Abby said fiercely. "You walked into that clinic and paid for a stranger. You did that." Silas shook his head slowly. "I paid Vance because I hate the man. I hate what he stands for." "And what does he stand for?" Silas set his coffee cup down. He sat up straight. The exhaustion left his eyes, replaced by a sudden, intense fire. "He stands for the idea that life has a price tag," Silas said, his voice ringing, with a sudden sharp clarity in the quiet room. He looked Abby directly in the eye. "In war, a general's blood runs just as red as a private's. I saw it on the battlefield 100 times. Death doesn't care about the brass on your collar or the gold in your vault. In the face of suffering, all humans are equal. Every single one." Abby listened, captivated by the sudden strength in his words. "It is our duty," Silas continued, his voice resolute, "our absolute duty as human beings to give unconditional compassion. Turning our backs on another's pain, because they are poor, or because they are a widow, or because they hold no station in society, that strips us of our own humanity. I forgot that for a long time. Vance reminded me. I couldn't let him look at you and decide your little girl's life was only worth what was in your pocket." Abby let the words wash over her. They were beautiful. They were true. "You are a good man, Silas," she said softly. "No," he replied, looking back at the sleeping child. "Just a man trying to remember how to be one." By the time the sun came up, painting the snow outside in pale gold, Clara's breathing was deep and even the fever was gone. Silas stood up. He packed his bag. He looked exhausted, but the heavy, crushing weight that usually sat on his shoulders seemed lighter. "Keep her warm," he instructed. Lots of broth, no solid food yet. I'll come back tonight to check her lungs." Abby walked him to the door. "I meant what I said about working to pay you back." Silas put his hat on. "The debt is paid, Mrs. Montgomery. Take care of your girl." He walked out into the crisp morning air. Abby watched him drive the wagon away. She felt a profound sense of gratitude. But she didn't know the storm was just beginning. Back in town, the morning sun hit the brick facade of the clinic. Dr. Vance sat at his desk. He was drinking tea. He had a headache from Sterling's expensive whiskey the night before. The door opened. Deputy Jedediah Boone walked in. He didn't bother to knock. Boone was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to a leather vest. He liked authority. He liked using it even more. "Morning, Doc," Boone said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the stove. "Boone, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Boone leaned against the wall. He smiled. It was a mean, thin smile. "Word travels fast in a small town," Boone drawled, "especially when Hattie Miller talks. Seems the Montgomery widow took a walk in the snow last night." Vance frowned. "So? She likely buried her kid by now." Boone took a sip of coffee. No, the kid is alive. Doing fine from what I hear. Vance sat up. Impossible. She had lobar pneumonia, and she only got... He stopped himself. She only got what? Doc, Boone asked, his eyes gleaming. I hear Silas Thorne drove his wagon out to the widow's place. I hear he brought a black bag with him. Stayed all night. Vance's face hardened. He understood instantly. Thorne, Vance spat. He quit the medical board 5 years ago. He let his territorial license expire. Boone grinned. He set the cup down. That's exactly right, Doc. Practicing medicine without a valid license in the territory of Wyoming. That's a crime. Carries a hefty fine. Or jail time. And the widow? Aiding and abetting a criminal act. Vance rubbed his chin. The gold piece in his pocket felt heavy. Thorne had humiliated him yesterday. He had made him look small. We have a duty to uphold the law, Deputy, Vance said smoothly. Yes, we do, Boone agreed. And I think Mr. Sterling would be very interested to hear that the widow might be headed for a jail cell. She owes him money on that land, doesn't she? She does indeed. Boone tipped his hat. I'll go get the paperwork started. Let's see how much that big mouth of his is worth when he's sitting in a cell. Sunday morning broke crisp and clear. The sky was a hard, bright blue, scraped clean by the wind. Clara was sitting up in bed. She was propped against 2 pillows, a doll clutched to her chest. Her color was good. Her eyes were bright. She was hungry. Mama, can we have biscuits? She asked. Her voice was thin but steady. Abby smiled. It felt like a muscle she hadn't used in a long time. She brushed a stray curl from Clara's forehead. We can, and bacon too. We have company coming for dinner. Clara's eyes went wide. Is it the big man? The one who made the terrible medicine? It says Mr. Thorne. And yes, his medicine tasted awful, but it made you better. Abby paused, smoothing the blanket. We are going to be very polite, Clara. We owe him a great deal. By noon, the small cabin smelled of rendering fat, baking flour, and coffee. It was the smell of a home. Right at noon, a heavy knock hit the door. Abby wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. Silas stood there. He had shaved. He wore a clean blue work shirt and a dark wool coat. He held his hat in his hands. He looked uncomfortable, like a wild horse forced into a small pen. Mr. Thorne, please, come in. He stepped inside. He seemed to take up the whole room. Something smells good, he muttered. Mama made biscuits, Clara announced from the bed. Because you saved my life. Thank you, sir. Silas froze. He looked at the little girl. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Then, very slowly, he nodded. You are welcome, Clara. Dinner was quiet at first. Silas ate with the focused efficiency of a soldier. Abby mostly watched him. She noticed the gray in his beard, the lines around his eyes. He was a man who carried a mountain of grief. Clara, however, had no concept of silence. She watched Silas finish his second. Mr. Thorne? Silas looked up. Yes. Do you have a little girl? Abby gasped. Clara, hush! Silas held up a hand. He didn't look angry. He looked sad. A bone-deep kind of sad. I did, Silas said, his voice quiet. Once. Where is she? Clara asked, her eyes huge. She went to heaven, Silas said, before I got to meet her. Her and her mother. Clara processed this with the serious logic of an 8-year-old. She put her fork down. That is very sad. You must be lonely all the time out at that big ranch. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at Clara, then he looked at Abby. No one had ever spoken to him so plainly about it. In town, people whispered. They looked away. They treated him like he was made of glass. I am, Silas finally said. It was the truest thing he had said in years. After dinner, Clara fell asleep. Healing took a lot of energy. Abby poured 2 cups of coffee. She sat across from Silas at the small pine table. I'm sorry, Abby said softly. She doesn't know any better. I shouldn't have let her ask. Don't apologize, Silas said. He ran a finger around the rim of his cup. It's just better than the whispers. The pity. Abby nodded. She knew about pity. When James died, it was awful. The sickness took him so slowly, the town was kind at first. They brought casseroles. They said prayers. But after a year, after two, they got tired of my sadness. They expected me to just move on. Like grief is a coat you can just take off when the weather gets warm. Silas looked at her, really looked at her. You felt like you had to hide it, so they wouldn't stop coming around. Yes, Abby admitted. It felt good to say it out loud. And then I realized they weren't coming around anyway, not unless they wanted something. So I stopped trying. They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment. It was as a shared understanding. Two people who knew the exact weight of a quiet house. A sharp knock broke the peace. Abby stood up. She opened the door. An older woman stood on the porch. She was tall, straight-backed, dressed in fine dark wool. Her silver hair was pinned tight. She held a walking stick, though she didn't seem to need it. It was Margaret Thorne, Silas' mother, the matriarch of the Thorne Ranch. Abby's stomach dropped. She knew what this was. She had braced herself for it. The wealthy mother coming to tell the poor widow Wu to stay away from her son, to stop trying to trap him. Mrs. Thorne, Abby said, lifting her chin. She wouldn't cower. Can I help you? Margaret stepped past her, into the house. She saw Silas sitting at the table. She saw the coffee cups. Mother, Silas said, standing up. He looked surprised. What are you doing here? I came to see the woman who finally got you out of that barn, Margaret said. Her voice was sharp, commanding, but her eyes weren't. Her eyes were shining. She turned to Abby. She didn't look at the modest cabin. She didn't look at Abby's faded dress. She looked right into Abby's eyes. Mrs. Montgomery, Margaret said, I owe you an apology and a thank you. Abby was stunned. I don't understand. Margaret leaned on her stick. For 5 years, my son has been a ghost. He worked himself to the bone during the day, and he stared at the fire all night. He wouldn't let anyone in. He wouldn't forgive himself for something he couldn't control. And society let him do it. Margaret's voice hardened with conviction. She stepped closer to Abby. Every human being, Margaret stated, her tone echoing with authority, has the right to make mistakes. They have the right to grieve. And most importantly, they have the fundamental right to forgive themselves. This society of ours, it is far too harsh. It is harsh on women left alone, and it is terribly harsh on men who carry invisible wounds. We demand they be strong. We demand they be silent. We strip them of their right to break. Margaret reached out. She took Abby's hands in her own. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I thank you, Abigail, Margaret said softly. I thank you for treating my son as a man worthy of understanding, not just a machine meant for labor. You saw a person in pain, and you asked for his help anyway. You gave him a reason to use his hands for something besides just building fences. Abby felt tears prick her eyes. She squeezed the older woman's hands. He saved my daughter, Mrs. Thorne. And you saved my son, Margaret replied. She let go and turned to Silas. You look better, Silas. Eat another biscuit. Then come home. She walked out the door, leaving silence in her wake. Silas looked at the door. Then he looked at Abby. She's a formidable woman, Abby whispered. She is, Silas agreed. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth, and she's usually right. 2 weeks passed. The snow melted it, turning the roads to thick, freezing mud. Clara was entirely well. To celebrate and to pay her debt, Abby did what she knew best. She opened a school. It wasn't a real schoolhouse, just her front parlor. She pulled in 2 extra benches. She found an old slate board in the barn. She invited the children from the neighboring farms, the poor ones, the ones who couldn't afford the fees at the town school. 7 children showed up on the first Monday. By Wednesday, there were 10. Abby was teaching them multiplication when the trouble arrived. A sleek black buggy pulled up to the cabin. The horse was a prime black gelding. The wheels were clean. Cornelius Sterling stepped down. He was a man who looked exactly like what he was, a banker who had never done a day of hard labor in his life. He wore a bowler hat, a tailored suit, and carried a leather briefcase. He didn't knock. He just walked right in. The children fell silent. They shrank back on their benches. They knew a predator when they saw one. "Mr. Sterling," Abby said. She put her chalk down. She stepped between the children and the banker. "You are interrupting my class." Sterling smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. It was a cold, calculating expression. He looked around the room, taking in the meager furnishings. "Class?" he chuckled. "I see a gathering of farm dirt in a house you won't own for much longer, Mrs. Montgomery." Abby stood her ground. "I own this house. My husband built it." Sterling opened his briefcase. He pulled out a piece of thick parchment. "Your husband built it on borrowed money. Money he borrowed from my bank 3 years ago." He held the paper out. "The balloon payment is due next Friday, $180, plus accrued interest." Abby felt the blood drain from her face. $180. She might as well try to touch the moon. She didn't even have $5 to her name. "James told me the loan was for $50, Abby said, her voice shaking. "For seed and a plow. We paid that back. We sent a payment every month." "You paid the minimums on a variable rate," Sterling said smoothly. He tapped the paper. "It's all right here, in the fine print, signed by James Montgomery. The principal has grown. The debt is due. If you cannot pay, the bank will foreclose on Friday. I will take the house, the barn, and the east acre with the creek access." He wanted the water rights. That's what this was about. He wanted the creek to supply his new cattle venture. He was dying, Abby whispered, the truth dawning on her. James was dying when he signed that. He was weak. You took advantage of a dying man. Sterling shrugged, tucking the paper back into his briefcase. "Business is business, Mrs. Montgomery. The law is on my side. Friday, have the money, or be gone." He turned and walked out. The buggy rolled away, leaving silence behind.
Abby sank into her chair.
She put her face in her hands. She had fought so hard. She had saved Clara. She had started a life. And now, a piece of paper was going to take it all away. Later that afternoon, Silas rode into town. He needed supplies for the ranch. He tied his horse outside Hadia's store. As he walked past the bank, he saw Toby. Toby was 16, an orphan. He worked for Silas at the ranch, a good, hard-working boy. But 2 years ago, before Silas hired him, Toby had swept floors at Sterling's bank to afford bread. Toby was standing by the alley, looking anxious. When he saw Silas, he hurried over. "Mr. Thorne," Toby said, looking over his shoulder. "I need to show you something. I heard what happened out at the widow's place today." Sterling's driver talks too much at the saloon. Silas frowned. "What happened?" "Sterling is taking her house, calling in a bad debt." Toby pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It looked old. Yellowed. "Mr. Thorne, when I worked for Sterling, he made me clean out the old files in the basement. He told me to burn them. I kept some, mostly just to practice reading." He handed the paper to Silas. "That's a copy of Mr. Montgomery's original loan, before Sterling locked the final version in his safe." Silas unfolded the paper. He read it. His jaw clenched. Muscles in his neck stood out like ropes. The original loan was for $50. Fixed rate. 5%. The paper Sterling had waved in Abby's face was a forgery, a legal trap, altered after James had signed the first document, hiding exorbitant, illegal interest rates in the fine print. Sterling had waited for James to die, waited for the interest to compound, and now he was stealing the land. "Is this the only one?" Silas asked, his voice low and dangerous. "No," Toby said nervously. "There's 3 more. The Miller farm, the Jenkins place. He did the same thing to them when they got sick." Silas folded the paper and put it in his coat. He didn't say another word to Toby. He turned and walked straight into the bank. The lobby was quiet. A teller looked up, startled by the heavy tread of Silas's boots. Sterling was sitting in his glass-walled office. He looked up, annoyed. Silas didn't knock. He opened the door and walked in. He didn't sit down. He tossed the yellowed paper onto Sterling's pristine desk. Sterling looked at it. The color left his face entirely. "Where did you get this?" Sterling demanded, his voice thin. Silas leaned over the desk. He planted his fists on the polished wood. "You built an empire on graves, Sterling," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a rumble, like an avalanche, starting far up a mountain. "This is private bank business, Thorne. You have no right." "I have every right," Silas interrupted. He stood up straight. His presence filled the small office. "Profiting off the misery of others isn't business, Sterling," Silas stated, his words hard and precise. "It is a blatant violation of human dignity. You target the sick. You target the widows. You use the law as a weapon to steal from people who are too weak to fight back." Sterling recovered a little of his bravado. "I provide capital. The terms are the terms. It's not my fault they can't manage their affairs. It is your fault when you change the terms." Silas fired back. "A civilized society is judged by how it protects its most vulnerable, not by how it enriches its most powerful. You are a thief in a suit. You strip people of their livelihood, their homes, and their pride." "You can't prove a thing," Sterling sneered. "That paper is just scrap. The official document is in my vault, signed and sealed." "We will see what a federal judge in Cheyenne thinks of your vault," Silas said. He turned toward the door. "You're a fool, Thorne." Sterling yelled after him. "You stick your nose where it doesn't belong. You think you're safe out on that ranch? I have friends in this town. Friends with badges." Silas paused at the door. He didn't look back. "Tell your friends to come," Silas said softly. "I'll be waiting." Sterling didn't waste time. He made his move the very next morning. Silas was mending a fence near the main road. The hammer struck iron with a steady rhythm. Clang, clang. It was honest work, the kind that kept a man's mind quiet. He heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders coming fast from town. Silas didn't stop.
Watched winging them approach.
It was Deputy Boone and Dr. Vance. They pulled up short, their horses blowing hard in the cold air. "Silas Thorne," Boone said, resting his hand on the butt of his pistol. It was a casual gesture, a threat meant to look like an accident. "Deputy," Silas replied. He finally set the hammer down. He wiped his hands on a rag. He didn't look at Vance. Boone pulled folded paper from his saddlebag. He tossed it into the dirt at Silas S. feet. "Warrant for your arrest, Thorne. Signed by Judge Crawford this morning." Silas didn't pick it up. "On what charge?" "Practicing medicine without a license in the territory of Wyoming." "Boone," sneered Dr. Vance, here filed the complaint. "Claims you treated the Montgomery girl. No territorial certificate on file." Vance puffed out his chest. "You're a danger to the public, Thorne. An unlicensed rogue. You think you can just do whatever you please because you own a big piece of land." Silas looked at the doctor. His eyes were flat. I saved a child you tried to kill with sugar water, Josiah. Vance flushed red. Slander? Boone, cuff him. That won't be necessary, Silas said. He stepped over the fence. I'll ride in. Let's see, Judge Crawford. The ride into town was quiet. Silas rode his big gray gelding. Boone and Vance flanked him. Word had already spread. People lined the boardwalks as they rode down Main Street. Some looked angry. Most just looked scared. Sterling had deep pockets, and Vance held the town's health in his hands. You didn't cross them. Abby was waiting outside the courthouse. Hattie Miller stood beside her. Toby was there too, shifting nervously from foot to foot. When Abby saw Silas, she rushed forward. Silas, she breathed. They came to my house. They asked if you treated Clara. I had to tell the truth. I'm so sorry. It's fine, Abby, Silas said, stepping down from his horse. He tied the reins to the rail. The truth is the only thing we have left. Judge Crawford's courtroom was small. It smelled of floor wax and stale cigars. The judge was an old man, sharp-eyed but weary. He liked the law clean and simple. Today was not going to be simple. Crawford banged his gavel. Court is in session. Let's get this over with. The Territory versus Silas Thorne. The charge is practicing medicine without a valid license. Vance stood up. He smoothed his vest. He looked incredibly self-important. Your Honor, Vance began, the law is clear. Title 4, Section 12 of the Territorial Health Code. No man may prescribe, treat, or act as a physician without a certificate from the board. Mr. Thorne's military credentials expired 5 years ago. He willfully and recklessly treated Abigail Montgomery's child. He must be held accountable. A $500 fine or 6 months in the county jail. Crawford peered over his spectacles at Silas. Mr. Thorne, you stand accused. Did you treat the child? I did, Your Honor, Silas said clearly. He didn't stand up. He just looked straight at the judge. A murmur went through the room, a confession. Just like that. Boone smiled from the back of the room. Vance looked triumphant. Well, Crawford said, tapping his gavel. That seems straightforward, Mr. Thorne. The law is the law. I have no choice but to, Your Honor. A voice rang out from the back of the room. It was Hattie Miller. She stood up, holding a thick, leather-bound ledger. She walked down the aisle, her boots clicking loudly on the wood floor. Mrs. Miller, Crawford sighed. This is a court of law, not a town meeting. I am aware, Elias stated, using his first name. They had known each other for 30 years. I wish to submit evidence regarding the character and actions of the accused. Irrelevant, Vance snapped. He confessed. Let her speak, Silas said quietly. Crawford waved a hand. Proceed, Hattie. Quickly. Hattie opened the ledger. She placed it on the judge's bench. Dr. Vance claims Silas Thorne is a rogue, Hattie began. Her voice was strong, carrying to every corner of the room. He claims Silas is a danger to the public because he lacks a piece of paper. She tapped the ledger. In this book are the names of 12 people. People in this very town. People Dr. Vance refused to treat because they couldn't pay. Vance shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, I object. Sit down, Josiah, Crawford ordered. Leaning forward to look at the book, Hattie continued. Old Man Higgins when his leg was crushed under his wagon. Sarah Jenkins when the fever took her baby. The Ramirez family out by the tracks when the cholera hit. 12 times in the last 5 years, when the licensed doctor turned his back, Silas Thorne went in the dark. The courtroom was completely silent. He didn't ask for money, Hattie said, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't ask for recognition. He brewed his black bag, he used his knowledge, and he saved lives. He did it quietly because he believed he wasn't worthy of the title anymore. But he is more of a doctor than Josiah Vance will ever be. Abby looked at Silas. He was staring at the floor. He looked uncomfortable, exposed. He hadn't wanted anyone to know. Judge Crawford picked up the ledger. He read a few lines. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Vance. "Is this true, Josiah?" the judge asked. "Did you turn these people away?" Vance sputtered. "I run a business, Elias. I can't treat every charity case that walks through the door. The law protects my right to run a profitable practice." "The law?" Judge Crawford mused. He closed the ledger and leaned back in his chair. He looked out over the crowded room. He looked at Abby, at little Toby, at Hattie. And then he looked directly at Dr. Vance and Deputy Boone. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with authority. It was the voice of a man who understood the difference between rules and justice. "The law was established to protect human rights, Dr. Vance," Judge Crawford declared, his words ringing clear in the silent room. "It was not written to serve as an instrument of oppression for men with deep pockets. It was not created to allow you to build a fortress of wealth while children suffocate in their beds." He picked up his gavel, but he didn't strike it. He held it like a pointing finger. "When written rules contradict compassion," the judge continued, "when they contradict the fundamental right to life, human conscience must stand above the law." Mr. Thorne acted not as a rogue, but as a human being answering the call of duty when the appointed professional failed. He stepped into the gap you left empty. Crawford turned to Silas. "Mr. Thorne, your actions saved a child's life. The court recognizes your prior service as a military surgeon. I am dismissing the charge of practicing without a license based on emergency necessity." Boone stepped forward. "You can't do that, Judge. The code says—" "I just did, Deputy," Crawford snapped. He brought the gavel down. Bang! "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted. People cheered. Abby grabbed Hattie and hugged her tight. Silas just let out a long breath. "However," Crawford said loudly, banging the gavel again to restore order, "Dr. Vance, please remain." The room quieted down. Vance looked nervous. "This court is deeply troubled by the testimony today," Crawford said, looking down at the doctor. "It seems your practice is entirely profit-driven, to the detriment of this community." Silas stood up. "Your Honor, if I may." Crawford nodded. "Go ahead, Silas." Silas turned to face Vance. The plump doctor shrank back slightly. "I don't want him in jail," Silas said. "Jail doesn't help anyone in this town." "What do you suggest?" the judge asked. He keeps his license," Silas said, "but he changes his practice. First, he treats every emergency, regardless of ability to pay. Second," Silas looked over at young Miller, the assistant who was shrinking in the back row, "he trains that boy properly. He pays for Miller to attend nursing school in Cheyenne this fall." Vance's jaw dropped. "That will cost a fortune. You can't dictate how I run my business." "I can," Silas said calmly, "because if you don't agree, I'll ride to Cheyenne myself. I'll present this ledger and the testimony of Abigail Montgomery regarding the expired medicine you sold her to the Territorial Medical Board. They will strip your license permanently." Vance looked at Boone. Boone looked away. Sterling wasn't here to save them. The bluff was called. Vance slumped in his chair. "Fine," he muttered. "I agree." Silas nodded. He turned and walked down the aisle. The crowd parted for him. Abby stepped into the aisle as he passed. "You did it," she whispered. "We did," Silas corrected her. "Now I have to go see a banker." Spring didn't arrive in Wyoming. It fought its way in. It came with cracking ice and deep, treacherous mud. The wind lost its bitter bite, turning into a cool, steady push against the prairie grass. In town, things felt different. Lighter. Doctor's kept his clinic doors open. He treated the blacksmith's apprentice for a burn. He didn't ask for a dime up front. Young Miller, the assistant, walked around with a new book under his arm, Anatomy. He looked terrified, but proud. Abby noticed the change. Everyone did. But Abby had her own problems. Good problems, mostly. Her school was growing. It started with 7 children. By the first week of April, it was 15. Her small parlor was bursting. The children sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor. They shared 3 slate boards. The air was thick with chalk dust and the smell of wet wool from their coats. Abby didn't mind the mess. She loved the noise. She loved the look in a child's eye when a word finally made sense. But the house was groaning under the weight. The roof leaked in the corner. The floorboards sagged. Then the wood arrived. Abby woke up one Tuesday morning. She stepped onto her front porch to shake out a rug. She stopped dead. Stacked neatly next to her steps was a pile of fresh-cut pine boards. Thick, straight, expensive. Beside them sat a wooden keg of iron nails and 2 buckets of white paint. There was no note. There was no wagon track in the mud. Just the wood. She smiled. It was a small, knowing smile. She touched the top board. The pine smelled like pitch and hard work. The next day, Abby took Clara to the general store to buy flour. They were gone for 2 hours. When they walked back up the dirt path to the cabin, Abby dropped her flour sack. The wall between the parlor and the old lean-to was gone. It had been knocked down clean. The floor had been extended, nailed down tight with a new pine. The room was suddenly twice as big. The leaky roof above the corner was patched with fresh cedar shingles. Inside, 3 new wooden benches sat facing the small chalkboard. They were sanded smooth, no splinters. "Mama, look," Clara pointed. On the teacher's desk, there was a brand new box of white chalk. Beside it sat a single, perfect red apple. Abby walked over to the desk. She touched the apple. It was cold. She walked to the window and looked out toward the horizon, toward the Thorn Ranch. She didn't see anyone, but she knew. That night, Abby brewed a pot of coffee. She poured a cup. She carried it out to the front porch and set it on the railing. She went to sleep. When she woke up at dawn, the cup was empty. It became their language. The silent conversations of 2 people who knew the value of a quiet deed. A broken hinge fixed. An empty cup. A load of firewood stacked perfectly against the house. An empty plate that used to hold a slice of pie. He never asked for thanks. She never offered it out loud. She just kept leaving the coffee. By mid-April, the snow was mostly gone. Saturday morning was bright. The sun actually felt warm. Abby was out front, sweeping the new porch stairs. She heard the horses. It was Silas. He was riding his big gray, leading a gentle-looking roan mare behind him. He tipped his hat as he rode up. He looked different in the sunlight, less like a shadow, more like a man. "Morning, Abby," he said. "Morning, Silas. Coffee is on the stove." He swung down from the saddle. "Not today. I came to ask a favor." Abby leaned on her broom. "A favor? From me?" Silas rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the road. He looked everywhere but at her. "The spring folds dropping out at the ranch," Silas said. His voice was a little rough, unused to small talk. "Toby is out of his mind, trying to name them all. I thought maybe Clara might want to come see them. And you. If you aren't busy." It was an invitation, a real one. Abby felt her heart skipping, just a small, sudden flutter in her chest. "Clara!" Abby called out. The door banged open. Clara ran out, her boots clattering on the new wood. "Yes, Mama. Mr. Thorne wants to know if you'd like to go see the baby horses." Clara gasped. She looked at Silas like he was holding the moon on a string. "Can I, truly?" Silas gave a short, stiff nod. "Truly." Clara ran to grab her coat. "I'd love to go, Silas," Abby said softly. He helped her up onto the roan mare. His hands were strong. They lingered on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, just enough to send a warm shock straight up her spine. The ride out to the ranch was beautiful. Wyoming was waking up. Green shoots of buffalo grass pushed through the dark earth. The sky was vast and endless. When they reached the Thorn Ranch, it wasn't the dark, scary place Abby remembered from the blizzard. It was alive. Cattle grazed in the distance. Ranch hands moved around the massive barns. Toby came running out to meet them, a huge grin on his face. "Miss Clara," Toby yelled. "Come on, there's a little paint foal that looks just like a cow." Silas lifted Clara down. She grabbed Toby's hand, and the two of them sprinted for the nearest barn. "Don't run behind them," Silas called out. It was a father-esque reflex. It slipped out naturally. He realized it. He stopped, looking a little shocked by his own voice. Abby pretended not to notice, but she smiled. Silas tied the horses to the corral fence. He leaned against the top rail, looking out over the valley. Abby walked up and stood beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. They just watched the wind ripple through the grass. "The school looks good," Silas finally said. "It does," Abby agreed. "Whoever fixed it did a masterful job. The benches are perfectly sanded. The children don't ruin their clothes anymore." Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Wood was just sitting in the barn, taking up space. Abby turned her head. She looked at his profile, the strong jaw, the straight nose. "Silas," he looked at her. "Thank you." He shifted his weight. "You don't owe me any thanks, Abby. It's a good thing you're doing, taking those kids in. But—" He paused, searching for the words. "It's a hard road. You don't charge them. I know you don't. How do you plan to survive?" It was a fair question. The deadline for Sterling's loan was only a week away. It hung over her like a heavy black cloud. She pushed the fear down. "Shouldn't let Sterling ruin today." "I'll figure the money out," Abby said firmly. "I always do." "But why?" Silas asked. He turned to fully face her. His eyes were intense. "You could teach at the county school in Cheyenne, make a real wage. Why stay here? Why fight so hard for 50 fiend-dirty farm kids who can't pay you a cent?" Abby looked out toward the barn. She could hear Clara laughing. It was a beautiful sound. She took a deep breath. The air smelled of sage and damp earth. "Because of that night in the clinic," Abby said. Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge of steel to it. Silas frowned. "Vance." "Yes?" "Vance?" Abby looked down at her hands resting on the fence rail. "I stood in that room, Silas. I held my dying child. I emptied my pockets. I offered everything I had in the world. 50 cents. She looked up at him. Her eyes were fierce, and he looked at me like I was dirt, Abby said. He looked at my daughter like she was a broken tool not worth fixing. He made a calculation. He decided her life had no value because we had no money. Silas's jaws tightened. "He's a fool." "He's not just a fool. He's what happens when the world decides human worth is tied to a gold coin," Abby said. She stepped a little closer to Silas. She needed him to understand this. It was the core of who she was. "Education is the only weapon that brings absolute equality, Silas," Abby declared. The words poured out of her, fueled by years of struggle and fiery conviction. She pointed toward the town in the distance. "I am teaching those poor children to read the laws that govern them," Abby said, her voice ringing clear and steady. "I am teaching them to write their own names with pride. I am doing it so that when they grow up, no banker, no doctor, no politician can ever look down on them. I am arming them with knowledge so no one can ever strip them of their rights or tell them their lives are only worth 50 cents. Silas stared at her. He didn't just hear the words. He felt them. They hit him right in the chest. He had spent 5 years hiding from the world because he thought it was broken beyond repair. He had thought all the light was gone. But looking at Abby Montgomery, standing in the Wyoming wind with fire in her eyes, he realized he was wrong. The light wasn't gone, it was right here, burning bright. Slowly, the tension drained out of Silas' shoulders. The hard, protective lines around his mouth softened. And then it happened. Silas smiled. It wasn't a half smile. It wasn't a polite nod. It was a real, full, genuine smile. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It completely transformed his face. The sorrow vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, breathtaking warmth. He looked 10 years younger. He looked handsome. He looked alive. Abby's breath hitched. She couldn't look away. Silas reached out. He didn't grab her. He just placed his large, rough hand gently over hers on the wooden fence rail. His skin was warm. "They are lucky to have you, Abby," Silas said softly. His thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles. "And so is this town." Abby looked down at their hands, then up into his eyes. "I'm not doing it alone anymore," she whispered. Silas' smile faded, but the warmth in his eyes stayed. It deepened. "No," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly murmur. "You're not?" He leaned in, just a fraction of an inch. The space between them crackled with sudden, undeniable tension. Abby could feel the heat radiating from him. She held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Mr. Thorne! Mr. Thorne!" Toby's voice shattered the quiet. Silas pulled back. He cleared his throat, taking a step away. Abby gripped the fence rail to steady herself. Her knees felt weak. Toby came running up, panting. Clara was right behind him, her cheeks flushed with joy. "Mr. Thorne," Toby gasped. "One of the mares just broke the lower corral fence. We need help." Silas nodded, slipping instantly back into the rancher. But before he walked away, he looked back at Abby. "Stay for supper," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Abby smiled, her heart still racing. "We will." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Abby helped in the massive ranch kitchen, working alongside Margaret Thorne. The older woman didn't say much, but she showed Abby where the good flour was kept and let her season the stew. It was an acceptance. When they finally rode back to town that evening, the stars were coming out. Millions of them, scattered like diamond dust across the black sky. Clara fell asleep in the saddle, leaning back against Abby's chest. Silas rode beside them. They didn't talk much. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. When they reached the cabin, Silas lifted Clara down and carried her inside. He laid her gently on the bed and pulled the quilt up. He walked back out to the porch where Abby was waiting. The night was cold. The wind was picking up again. "Friday is coming, Abby," Silas said quietly. He didn't want to ruin the day, but he couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The loan deadline. Sterling. Abby crossed her arms against the chill. The warm glow of the day faded, replaced by the cold reality of her debt. "I know," she said. "I have money, Abby. Let me pay it." Abby closed her eyes. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. Just say yes and the nightmare ends. But she shook her head. "I can't, Silas. If you pay it, Sterling wins. He proves that a woman alone can't survive. He proves that money is the only thing that dictates a person's fate. It's my fight." Silas stepped closer. He looked down at her in the dark. "It doesn't have to be just your fight," he said. "I have to try," Abby insisted, looking up at him. "I have a few things left. James's watch, my wedding ring, a silver tea set my grandmother gave me. I'll go to Cheyenne. I'll sell them." Silas stared at her. He saw the stubborn pride. He hated it, and he loved it at the same time. "All right," Silas said softly, "but you know where to find me if you fall short." "I know," Abby whispered. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked down the steps and swung up onto his horse. Abby watched him ride away into the dark. She touched her left hand. She felt the gold band on her ring finger. She was going to lose everything to fight Cornelius Sterling. But for the first time in 3 years, she knew that even if she lost the house, she wouldn't be lost. She had a foundation, and it was stronger than pine boards and iron nails. The clock ticked. It was Friday. Abby sat at her small pine table. The wood was polished bright. On it sat 3 things: a heavy silver pocket watch. It belonged to James. It didn't keep time anymore, but the silver was thick. A small, ornate tea set, tarnished, passed down from her grandmother, and her wedding ring, a simple, thin band of gold. She stared at them. They were memories. They were pieces of a life that was gone, and they were all she had left to fight Cornelius Sterling. She had gone to Cheyenne the day before. She rode the stagecoach 3 hours each way. She walked into 4 different pawn shops. The men behind the counters looked at her faded dress. They saw desperation. They offered her pennies on the dollar. She took the money. She had to. Now, she pulled the small canvas pouch from her pocket and emptied it onto the table next to the jewelry. She counted the bills and the coins. She counted them 3 times. Her heart sank a little lower with each tally. $74.12. It wasn't enough, not even half. The balloon payment was $180, plus interest. She picked up the gold ring. It felt weightless. She slipped it onto her finger. She took it off. She put it back in her pocket. She couldn't do it. She couldn't save the farm. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Abby jumped. She quickly scooped the money back into the pouch. She stood up, smoothing her apron. She took a deep breath. She had to face him. She had to stand tall. She opened the door. It wasn't Sterling, it was Silas. He didn't look like a rancher today. He wore a dark suit, a clean white shirt, a string tie. He held his hat in one hand. In the other, he held a black leather valise. It looked heavy. "Silas," Abby breathed. "What are you doing here?" He didn't ask to come in. He just stood on the porch, looking at her. His eyes were dark and serious. "It's Friday, Abby. I know what day it is." She looked away. She couldn't look him in the eye. "Not right now. I went to Cheyenne. I sold some things." "Did you get enough?" he asked quietly. Abby swallowed hard. The lump in her throat was the size of a stone. She shook her head. The movement was small, defeated. "No," she whispered, "I have $74. Silas didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer pity. He stepped onto the porch and held out the leather valise. "Take this," he said. Abby looked at the bag. She knew what was in it. "Silas." "No. We talked about this. I cannot take your money. It's charity." "I won't be a charity case." "It's not charity," Silas said firmly. His voice left no room for argument. "It's an investment." Abby frowned. She looked up at him. "An investment? In what?" "In the school. In the community, Silas said. He stepped closer. The scent of bay rum and clean wool surrounded him. "Abby, this isn't just about your pride anymore. It's about stopping a man who is bleeding this town dry. Let me help you." Abby looked at the bag. Then she looked at Silas. She saw the absolute determination in his eyes. He wasn't trying to rescue a damsel in distress. He was offering a partnership, a weapon for war. She slowly reached out and took the valise. It was heavy, much heavier than $180 should be. "I will pay you back," Abby said fiercely. Her voice shook every single cent, "if it takes me 20 years. "I know you will," Silas said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'll see you at the bank." He turned and walked down the steps. Abby went inside. She opened the valise. She gasped. It wasn't just filled with bills. It was filled with stacks of greenbacks, bound tight. Hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands. Silas Thorne hadn't brought enough to pay her loan. He had brought enough to buy the town. 10 o'clock. The morning sun hit the large glass windows of the Dusty Creek Bank. Sterling sat behind his polished mahogany desk. He was drinking coffee from a fine china cup. He was checking his pocket watch. He was waiting. The heavy oak doors of the bank pushed open. Abby walked in. She wore her best dress. It was old, but it was clean and pressed. Her back was straight. Her head was high. She carried the heavy black valise. Right behind her walked Silas Thorne. He looked like a storm rolling in off the plains. Dark, unstoppable. Sterling saw them. He smiled. It was the smile of Wolf, watching a sheep walk into a pen. He stood up and walked out of his office into the main lobby. He wanted everyone to see this. He wanted the teller, the clerk, and the two farmers waiting in line to witness his power. Ah, Mrs. Montgomery, Sterling greeted her smoothly. His voice echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Right on time. I trust you brought the money to settle your late husband's debt? Abby stopped 3 feet from him. Silas stopped right behind her shoulder, a silent, towering guard. I have the money, Mr. Sterling, Abby said. Her voice was calm, steady. She placed the heavy valise on the teller's counter. The thud made the clerk jump. She unbuckled the straps. She pulled out a stack of bills. She counted out exactly $180. She slid the pile across the polished wood toward the banker. My debt is paid, Abby declared. Now, give me the deed to my farm. Sterling looked at the money. He didn't touch it. He chuckled, a slow, condescending sound. I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Mrs. Montgomery, Sterling said. He pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket and unfolded it. This is the final accounting of your loan. You see, the principal is $180. But the interest has been compounding monthly at a variable rate. He tapped the paper. The total amount due today is $247.50. Short of that, the bank takes the property. Abby felt the floor drop out from under her. $247. It was an impossible sum. He had rigged the game so she couldn't win. The two farmers in the lobby muttered to each other. They looked angry. They knew exactly what Sterling was doing. He was legally stealing her land. Abby looked at Silas. She expected him to step forward, to yell, to threaten. But Silas didn't move. He just watched Sterling. I don't have $247, Abby said, her voice tightening. The original loan was for $50. You altered the terms, Sterling. You tricked a dying man. Sterling shrugged, his face a mask of false sympathy. As I told you before, Mrs. Montgomery, business is business. I have a responsibility to my shareholders. The law is the law. If you cannot pay the full amount, I must ask you to leave the premises. The sheriff will be at your property this afternoon. Abby stood frozen. The sheer injustice of it burned in her chest. Then Silas moved. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't raise his fist. He simply stepped up to the counter beside Abby. He reached into the open valise. He pulled out another stack of bills. Then another. Then another. He tossed them onto the counter. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The piles of greenbacks hit the wood like physical blows. Sterling's eyes bulged. The clerk stopped breathing. The farmer's mott stepped closer, staring in disbelief. Count it, Silas said. His voice was low, hard, and terrifyingly calm. Sterling hesitated, then reached for the money. His hands were shaking, he counted. $300, Sterling stammered. He looked up at Silas, confused. This is more than her debt. I know, Silas said. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the folded, yellowed piece of paper Toby had given him. the copy of the original unaltered loan document. He slammed it down on the counter, right on top of the money. That, Silas stated loudly, his voice echoing off bank walls, is a copy of the original loan contract you made with James Montgomery. Fixed rate, 5%. A document you illegally altered after it was signed. Sterling S. face went paper white. Where did you get that? It doesn't matter, Silas said. He leaned over the counter, getting right in Sterling's face. Now, Silas commanded, you are going to take your $247, and you're going to hand Mrs. Montgomery the deed to her farm, free and clear. Right now? Sterling swallowed hard. He looked at the money. He looked at the old paper. He looked at the giant of a man staring him down. The banker's greed warred with his fear. Fear won. Miller, Sterling barked at the clerk. Get the Montgomery deed from the vault. Stamp it paid in full. The clerk scrambled away. A moment later, he returned, slapping the heavy stamp onto the parchment. Thump. He handed the deed to Abby. Abby took the thick paper. Her hands shook. It was over. The farm was hers. She looked at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But Silas wasn't finished. He pointed at the remaining pile of money on the counter. Now, Silas said, turning his attention back to Sterling, bring me the ledgers for the Miller farm, the Jenkins place, and the Ramirez family. Sterling backed away. Now see here, Thorne. You can't just come in here and bring the ledgers. Silas roared. The sound vibrated in the glass windows. Sterling jumped. He gestured frantically to the clerk, who ran to fetch the heavy leather books. Silas grabbed the ledgers. He didn't even look at the numbers. He looked at the total debt for each farm. He reached into the valise and pulled out more money. He piled it on the counter. Hundreds, thousands. I am buying their debt, Silas announced to the entire room. He turned to the two farmers who were watching in stunned silence. Every bad loan this man holds over a struggling family in this county. I am paying it in full. Sterling watched, horrified and fascinated, as the pile of cash grew. You're crazy, Sterling whispered. You're throwing away a fortune. Silas finished emptying the valise. He shoved the empty bag aside. He looked at the mountain of cash on the counter. Then he looked at Sterling. Silas's face was cold, hard, absolute. I didn't bring this money to buy their gratitude, Sterling, Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence. He turned slightly, making sure Abby and the farmers heard every word. I am using it to smash a system that strips people of their freedom, Silas declared loudly. The words rang with undeniable truth. Helping our fellow human beings rise up is not dispensing charity. It is enforcing justice. Silas turned his dark gaze back to the banker. You thought you could use the law to crush people who had no voice, Silas continued, his tone sharp as a knife. You thought poverty meant they had no rights. But human dignity is not a commodity to be traded in your ledger book. It cannot be bought, and it will not be stolen. Silas pointed a long finger at the pile of cash. Take your money, Silas commanded. Stamp every one of those deeds paid in full. Hand them to me. And then I suggest you pack your bags and leave Wyoming. Because if I ever catch you writing another fraudulent contract in this territory, I won't bring money. I'll bring the federal marshal. Sterling didn't argue. He didn't speak. He just nodded, his face pale and slick with sweat. He signaled the clerk to start stamping. 10 minutes later, Silas Thorne walked out of the Dusty Creek Bank. He didn't have the valise of money. Instead, he carried a stack of heavy parchment deeds. He walked down the steps. Abby followed him, her heart soaring. When they reached the street, Silas stopped. He turned to face the town square. People had gathered. Word had spread fast. Hattie Miller was there. Deputy Boone was watching from the porch of the saloon, looking nervous. Toby was standing by the horses. Silas didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. He simply walked over to a metal burn barrel sitting outside the general store. The fire inside was burning low. Took the stack of bank ledgers containing the predatory loan agreements. He dropped them into the fire. The heavy paper caught. The flames leaped up, turning the fraudulent contracts into ash and smoke that drifted away on the Wyoming wind. Silas turned to Abby. He held out the deeds to the Miller, Jenkins, and Ramirez farms. Toby, Silas called out. The boy ran over. Take these, Silas instructed, handing Toby the deeds. Deliver them. Tell them their land belongs to them. Toby took the papers. His eyes were wide with awe. Yes, sir, Mr. Thorne. Toby ran off down the street. Silas finally looked down at Abby. The hard edge was gone from his face. The fire in his eyes had softened into something entirely different. It's done, Silas said quietly. Abby held her own deed tight against her chest. She looked up at the big quiet man who had just saved her town. You really did it, Abby whispered. You paid for everything. No, Silas replied, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. I just bought a little freedom. What we build with it is up to us. The dust settled in Dusty Creek, literally and figuratively. 3 days after the fire in the burn barrel, Sterling packed his bags. He left on the midnight stagecoach. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. The territorial authorities arrived a week later. They seized the bank. They audited the ledgers. They found exactly what Silas knew they would find. Years of rot. But the town didn't rot with it. The town woke up. You could see it in the way people walked. The farmers didn't shuffle into Hattie's store looking at their boots anymore. They stood tall. They looked each other in the eye. A heavy blanket had been lifted off the prairie. Down at the clinic, things were changing too. Dr. Vance still wore his fine vests. He still liked the sound of his own voice, but he kept the door unlocked. Young Miller, his assistant, was reading medical books every free minute he had. Vance actually answered his questions. Fear was a powerful motivator. Silas Thorne had put the fear of God into Josiah Vance, but the biggest change was out at the Montgomery place. The school was thriving. Abby had 20 children sitting in her expanded parlor now. They came from the farms. They came from the edges of town. They came hungry to learn. And Silas was always there. He didn't hover. He didn't interfere with her teaching. But he was a constant, steady presence. He built proper desks. He brought firewood. He sat on the porch in the afternoons, whittling a piece of cedar, just listening to the sound of Abby S.'s voice, reading poetry through the open window. It was late May. The wildflowers were blooming. Splashes of purple and yellow painted the green grass. It was a Saturday. School was out. Abby was in town buying supplies. Sis rode up to the cabin. He found Clara sitting on the front steps. She was trying to braid a doll's hair made of yarn. She looked frustrated. Silas tied his horse. He walked over and sat down on the step beside her. He took off his hat. Having trouble? He asked. Clara sighed. The yarn is too thick. It keeps coming undone. Silas held out his large, calloused hands. Let me try. Clara handed him the doll. Silas' hands were built for roping cattle and setting bones. But they moved with surprising gentleness. He separated the yarn. He wove it together, tight and neat. He tied it off with a small piece of twine. He handed it back. Clara beamed. You're very good at that. I used to braid ropes, Silas said. Same idea, just smaller. He looked out at the rolling hills. He took a deep breath. He had faced down charging bulls. He had faced down armed men. but his heart was beating faster right now than it had in years. "Clara," Silas said softly, "I want to ask you a question." Clara looked up. She saw the serious look on his face. She put her doll down in her lap. "Okay, I like coming here," Silas started. He chose his words carefully. He wanted to be honest. He needed to do this right. "I like building things for the school, but mostly I like being around you and your mother." Clara nodded slowly. "Mama likes you too. She doesn't look sad anymore when she thinks nobody is watching." That hit Silas right in the chest. A solid, aching truth. "I was a very sad man for a long time," Silas told her. "I lost my family. I thought I would be alone forever. But your mother, she reminded me how to live. She is the bravest person I know." He turned to fully face the little girl. "I want to ask your mother to marry me," Silas said. Words felt heavy. They felt real. "I want to be your family. But I would never do that without asking you first. I am not trying to replace your father, Clara. I just want to stand beside you both, if you'll have me." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She was 8 years old, but she had seen more hardship than most adults. She knew the difference between a lie and the truth. She reached out her small hand. She placed it over his large one. "You make Mama smile," Clara said simply, "and you make good biscuits. I think my father would want us to be happy." She gave his hand a squeeze. "You have my permission, Mr. Thorne." Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He smiled. He pulled the little girl into a gentle hug. "Thank you, Clara. You can call me Silas if you want." "Okay, Silas." That evening, the sun went down in a blaze of orange and pink. Clara was asleep. The cabin was quiet. Abby stepped out onto the porch. She held 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Silas. He was leaning against the railing, watching the stars come out. "It's a beautiful night," Abby said. "It is," Silas agreed. He took a sip of the coffee. He set the cup down on the rail. He turned to her. He didn't want to wait anymore. He had wasted 5 years of his life in the dark. He wasn't going to waste another minute. "Abby." She looked at him. The moonlight caught her eyes. They were bright. They were intelligent. They were everything to him. "The bank is gone," Silas said. "The town is breathing again. Your school is built." "It is," Abby said softly. She could feel the shift in the air, the heavy electric pull between them. "I told you once that I was a broken man," Silas continued. His voice was low, rhythmic, steady. "I told you I had nothing left to give. I was wrong." He took a step closer. "You brought me back to life, Abigail Montgomery," Silas said. "You walked 2 miles in a blizzard. You stood up to a banker with nothing but your pride and a handful of coins. You fight for people who can't fight for themselves. I don't want to just watch you do it anymore." He reached out. He took both of her hands in his. His grip was warm, anchoring. "I want to stay," Silas said. "I want to wake up in this house. I want to help you build that school. I want to be a father to Clara. I am asking you to marry me." Abby's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the man standing before her. He was wealthy. He was powerful. He could have anyone. But he was standing on her porch, asking to share her life. She didn't cry. She didn't faint. She stood tall. She squeezed his hands back. "Silas," Abby said. Her voice was crystal clear in the quiet night. "When James died, I learned a very hard lesson. Learned that society looks at a woman without a man as incomplete. They look at her as weak. They think she needs to be rescued." Silas started to speak, to protest, but she stopped him gently. "I know you don't think that," Abby said. She looked deeply into his eyes. "And that is exactly why my answer is yes." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I will marry you, Silas Thorne," Abby stated, her words carrying the weight of a solemn vow. but I need you to know why. True love must be built on absolute equality. You don't look at me as a weak widow who needs saving. You never have. You respect me as an independent woman with a voice and the right to direct my own life. You stood beside me at that bank, but you let me hand over the money. You let me fight my own battles. That kind of respect, that is the greatest form of love there is. Silas listened. He absorbed every word. He felt a profound sense of awe for the woman standing in front of him. I don't want to save you, Abby, Silas whispered fiercely. I just want to be lucky enough to stand next to you. He let go of her hands. He reached up, gently framing her face. His thumbs brushed her cheekbones. He leaned down. The kiss was slow. It was deep. It was a promise. It tasted like coffee and cold night air and the absolute certainty of a new beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. They were both breathing hard. So, Silas murmured, a smile in his voice, does this mean I have to learn how to grade spelling papers? Abby laughed. It was a beautiful, clear sound that rang out over the prairie. Yes, Mr. Thorne, she said, it absolutely does. July came in hot and bright. Dusty Creek had never seen a wedding quite like it. It wasn't held in the dark, stuffy church. It was held outside, right in the front yard of the newly expanded Montgomery Thorne schoolhouse. The whole town was there. Hattie Miller wore a brand new blue silk dress. She sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief before the ceremony even started. Margaret Thorne sat next to her. She looked regal. She looked at peace. She had her son back. Even Dr. Vance showed up. He stood in the back row, near the punch bowl. He looked a little uncomfortable, but he was there. And young Miller, the assistant, was sitting near the front, holding Clara's hand to keep her from squirming. Toby stood at the front. He was Silas's best man. He wore a borrowed suit that was a little too big in the shoulders, but he stood with his back perfectly straight, bursting with pride. The afternoon sun poured golden light over the grass. Silas stood waiting. He wore a tailored black suit. His silver-streaked hair was combed back. He looked strong. He looked entirely whole. The music started. A fiddle player from the saloon played a slow, sweet hymn. Abby walked down the grassy aisle. She didn't wear an expensive imported gown. She wore a simple white cotton dress. It was clean. It was elegant. She carried a bouquet of wild prairie roses she and Clara had picked that morning. Silas couldn't take his eyes off her. The crowd faded away. The town faded away. There was only her. She reached his side. She handed the flowers to Clara. She took his hands. The old town preacher smiled at them. We are gathered here today under God's open sky to join this man and this woman. The traditional words flowed over them. But when it came time for the vows, they had agreed to speak their own. Abby went first. Her voice was steady. It carried to the back of the crowd. I came to this town with nothing but pride and a sick child, Abby said, looking into Silas's dark eyes. You didn't see my poverty. You saw my humanity. You gave me a foundation when I had none. I choose you, Silas, not because I need you to survive, but because I want you as my partner in living. I promise to stand by you, to build with you, and to love you until my last breath. Silas squeezed her hands. He took a deep breath. His voice, usually so quiet, resonated with deep, unshakable conviction. Abigail, Silas began. He didn't rush. He wanted the words to sink into the very earth they stood on. I spent years believing my life was over, Silas said. You showed me that purpose doesn't die. It just waits to be found again. You taught me that true strength isn't in isolation, but in community. He paused. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the faces of the people he had helped save from Sterling. Then he looked back at the woman he loved. "I swear to always protect your freedom, Abby," Silas declared, his words ringing out like a bell in the quiet afternoon. "And I swear to respect your equal rights in this family and in society. You are my partner, my equal in all things. Together, we will build a home where human compassion is the only currency that holds any value." A ripple went through the crowd. Women squeezed their husbands' hands. Men nodded slowly. It was a radical thing to say out loud in 1879, but Silas spoke it as absolute gospel. "I love you," Silas whispered just for her. "I love you too," Abby whispered back. "I pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher smiled. "Psyche-sauce, you make us your bride." He did. And the town cheered. The reception lasted late into the night. There was dancing. There was too much food. Silas even danced a clumsy waltz with Clara, making the little girl laugh until she hiccuped. Later that evening, Silas and Abby stood near the edge of the property, away from the noise. They looked at the new sign Silas had erected near the road that morning. The paint was barely dry. "Montgomery Thurn School and Community Clinic. All are welcome." Silas had officially renewed his medical license, but he wasn't competing with Vance. He opened the clinic room in the back of the schoolhouse, free of charge, for anyone who needed it. He was training Toby to assist him. "It looks perfect," Abby said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It's a start," Silas said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "We have a lot of work to do." "We do," she agreed. She looked up at him in the moonlight. "Are you ready?" "With you?" Silas smiled. "I'm ready for anything." 1 year later, winter returned to Wyoming in 1879 with a vengeance. The wind howled down the valley. The snow blew sideways, white and blinding. Inside the Montgomery Thorne Clinic, it was warm. A fire crackled in the iron stove. The room smelled of clean linen, carbolic soap, and eucalyptus. Toby stood by the counter. He was 17 now. He had grown 3 inches. He wore a crisp white apron over his shirt. A stethoscope hung around his neck. He was reading a medical journal Silas had ordered from Boston. The heavy front door banged open, letting in a swirl of snow. A young woman stumbled inside. She was thin, exhausted. She carried a bundle wrapped in a threadbare blanket, a baby. The infant was coughing a weak, raspy sound that Toby instantly recognized. The woman kicked the door shut. She stood shivering near the stove. She looked around the clean, bright room with terrified eyes. She didn't know Silas Thorne. She had just arrived on a wagon train from Nebraska. She only knew what the man at the livery stable had told her when she begged for help. "Go to the schoolhouse. Go to the back door." Toby put his book down. He walked around the counter. His face was calm, projecting the quiet authority Silas had taught him. "Ma'am," Toby said gently, "come over here by the fire. Let me see the child." The young mother stepped back. She clutched the baby tighter. Her hands were shaking violently. She reached into her ragged coat pocket. She pulled out a small handful of copper pennies. She held them out in her trembling, frostbitten palm. I only have 30 cents, she whispered. Tears spilled over her frozen cheeks. "I know it's not enough. Please, I'll clean. I'll work. Just look at him." Toby froze. The words echoed in the room. They echoed through time. He remembered the story Abby had told him. He remembered the cold night that had changed all their lives. He looked at the 30 cents in the woman's desperate, shaking hand. Then he looked her right in the eye. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with profound, absolute respect. Toby reached out. He gently closed her fingers over the coins, pushing her hand back toward her pocket. He smiled. It was a warm, bright smile. "A human life doesn't have a price tag, ma'am," Toby said. his voice ringing with the unshakable truth he had learned in this very house. Here, compassion has already paid for everything. Put your money away. Please, come in. He took the heavy bundle from her arms. He carried the baby toward the warm examination table. Outside, the wind raged on, but inside, the light burned steady and bright. In Dusty Creek, no one remembered the 50 cents anymore. They remembered the man and the woman who proved that human dignity is the one thing no money can buy.
As the snow melts and the prairie awakens under the gentle light of spring, we leave behind the harrowing night of fear, desperation, and injustice, and step into a quiet understanding of what truly matters. This story reminds us that human life cannot and should not be measured by wealth, social status, or the coins in one's pocket. Abby Montgomery's courage, fueled by a mother's unwavering love, shows that even in the coldest, harshest winters, hope can endure when one refuses to surrender to despair. Silas Thorne's actions teach us that true strength is not measured by might or fortune, but by compassion, by standing for what is right, even when the law or the world may judge you. In the end, it is the quiet, persistent deeds of those willing to act selflessly, saving lives, protecting the innocent, standing up against corruption, that shape a community and preserve our shared humanity. This tale encourages us to see the value in every life, to act with empathy toward those in need, and to remember that courage is often found in the ordinary, in acts of kindness that ripple far beyond the moment. It teaches that love, integrity, and justice are stronger than fear, greed, or indifference, and that one person's determination to do right can spark change that touches many. As the prairie stretches wide and endless, let this story linger in our hearts, a reminder that, like the snow thawing under the morning sun, human kindness, courage, and hope always find a way to shine, even in the darkest of times. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.